You know, the case of Jeffrey Dahmer presents this huge, unsettling paradox in criminal justice. He did things that are so horrific, they just seem to scream insanity. But in the eyes of the law, was he actually insane? That was the single terrifying question at the heart of his entire trial.
I mean, listen to this stuff. Murder, dismemberment, cannibalism, these grotesque experiments. These are not the actions of a typical criminal, right? They feel like they come from a place of pure madness. And yet, the man behind it all, he presented a very, very different picture.
He confessed to all of it, just calmly sat there and recounted 15 horrific murders in chilling detail. So there was never any question of if he did it. The only question was why, and, crucially, whether he was legally responsible for any of it.
So his lawyers argued that he was not guilty by reason of mental disease, and this put the jury in an almost impossible spot. Just imagine, you have to look at a man who did these unspeakable things and decide, is he a calculating monster, or is he a man so profoundly sick that he just couldn't control himself?
Okay, so let's start with the defense. Their entire strategy really rested on painting Dahmer not as a killer, but as a victim of his own mind.
The core of their argument was that Dahmer was basically trapped inside this psychological storm. They claimed his necrophilia, his sexual attraction to corpses, was an urge so powerful and so disturbing that it just completely destroyed his ability to follow the law.
And to build this case, the defense experts brought out a whole constellation of potential diagnoses. They weren't just arguing that one thing was wrong, they were trying to paint a picture of a man who was broken in multiple, complex ways. The strategy, it seems, was to show that the sheer weight of all these illnesses just crushed his ability to control himself.
Now, a really key part of their strategy was that Dahmer himself never took the stand. This was a very calculated move. You see, it created distance. It stopped the jury from looking him in the eye and potentially seeing a cold, calculating person. Instead, his story was filtered. It was psychologized through the testimony of experts, which made him seem more like a clinical case study than an actual killer.
The prosecution, however, well, they told a very, very different story. They argued that behind all the bizarre and horrific acts was a man who was methodical, calculating, and fully in control of his choices.
So the defense's entire case really hinged on this one idea: uncontrollable urges. But the prosecution, they had a truly devastating piece of evidence to counter that claim. And the best part? It came from Dahmer himself.
Those were Dahmer's own words, spoken before the trial even began. And for the prosecution, this was basically a silver bullet. He admits to having choices. He admits he made the wrong ones. I mean, that's not the language of someone who's powerless, is it? It's the language of accountability.
And the prosecution backed this up with a mountain of evidence that showed just how meticulously he planned everything. He didn't just stumble into these murders. He bluffed doctors to get pills, he drugged his victims, he had taxis drop him off blocks away to avoid being noticed, and he systematically destroyed evidence. These are the actions of someone who knows exactly what he's doing and knows that it's wrong.
So the jury was stuck with these two completely conflicting narratives: a sick man versus a cunning killer. Now, to decide between them, they couldn't just rely on their gut feelings. They had to rely on the strict legal definition of insanity.
And this right here is probably the most important point. Insanity in a courtroom is not the same thing as mental illness in a doctor's office. It's a legal concept. The law doesn't really ask, is this person mentally ill? It asks a much more specific question. Did their illness prevent them from understanding right from wrong, or from being able to control their actions?
In Wisconsin, where the trial was held, this legal standard was broken down into a really clear two-part test for the jury. First, they had to decide, did Dahmer even have a mental disease in the first place? And only if they answered yes to that could they even move on to the second, crucial question: did that disease actually cause his actions? So let's put it this way. Mental illness is a medical diagnosis made by a doctor. Insanity is a legal conclusion made by a jury. You can absolutely have a diagnosed mental illness and still be found legally sane if that jury believes you knew what you were doing was wrong and you could have controlled yourself. That distinction is what this entire case turned on.
After less than a day of deliberation, the jury came back with its decision. They were ready to answer that fundamental question. Were Dahmer's actions the product of sickness, or were they the product of calculated evil?
And the verdict really came down to a single decisive number, 10.
10 out of the 12 jurors answered no to the very first question of that insanity test. They found that, legally speaking, Dahmer did not have a mental disease. And because they answered no to Part 1, they never even had to consider Part 2. For the law, the case was closed. Jeffrey Dahmer was sane, and therefore he was responsible. But even Dahmer himself seemed to exist in that gray area between these two ideas. In his own words, he kind of acknowledges the conflict. He wasn't even sure if he was sick or evil or maybe some terrifying combination of the two.
The jury drew a line based on the law. But philosophically, and for the public, well, the question is still out there. When acts are this monstrous, can we ever truly separate the sickness from the evil?